I was asked, I was told that this is question and answer period. And so going back and looking at my sixth grade literature primer, I've discovered that a question is a short sentence followed by a question mark. And so for the benefit of everyone here, I'll take your short questions, starting with the gentleman over here. Oh, I thought you were going to ask a question.
Oh, okay.
With the lady over here. Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
Is your database large enough that if someone has ancestry from other countries, it would really tell them something?
The question was, did everyone hear the question? Is your database large enough that you can actually find countries? The answer is unequivocally yes. In fact, for a couple of populations, we've hit real critical mass. So if you are, Scottish, or you are Irish, or you are Eastern European Jewish, I guarantee you will have matches in our database to other people who know their ancestry. So we have two different types of tests. Those tests that go on the straight line, the father's father and the mother's mother. And when you look at those databases, you'll see, just like the girl from whose family was from Finland, that it very accurately pointed towards Finland for her ancestry. We have that other test that provides you ethnic percentages. We don't have to have a large database for that. What we have to have is a large reference database, which in many cases is an academic database, whether the information comes from cooperative scientists or from the 1,000 Genomes Project. We'll harvest that data, put it into our database as anonymous country information, and then your results would be bounced off of that. So you might think of yourself as English, and this is the kind of the typical example I use. However, if you think of yourself as English, but your ancestors came from the coastline, the odds are quite high that you will show some Scandinavian DNA, even though the Vikings stopped coming to England 800 years ago. What's typically happened is those Viking men got off their ships, married English ladies, settled in that area. The children of those marriages married within and married within, so that Scandinavian DNA never left. It's still there in a residual 8%, 10%, 20% of your DNA. And so a lot of people take these tests and find a country or a region where they have some DNA that matches that really surprises them, but for good historical and genetic reasons. Okay.
Yes, I'm a psychologist who's adopted, as a matter of fact, and you alluded in the interview to the psychological impact of finding genetic data that one might not find palatable emotionally. Have you ever thought of helping people or referring people who have to deal with those kinds of issues? How do you deal with the psychological part other than retesting to see if there was a mistake?
Quite often, if people are adopted, either they're working on their own or they're working with what's called a search angel. Someone who really knows genealogy, who really knows records, and who just has a knack for figuring out where they might find a record. And so a lot of that sensitivity training comes from those folks. On the other hand, when we have people who get an unexpected result and we're their first door, we spend a lot of time with our dozen customer service reps to get them to the point that where they understand that they're going to talk to people who are going to be surprised or perhaps shocked by the results. We talk to them about how they need to answer those folks, that they need to listen more than talk, that they need to be, sympathetic but open. And we tell them that they can spend about 30 minutes on the phone, and then they need to figure out how to wrap it up. Most of our customers, again, because they're genealogists, are a little bit more understanding of a non-paternity event. And also what we find is that people who don't know that there's been a non-paternity event after they find there's been a non-paternity event, they start looking back in their own lives and they say, you know, there were hints or there were signals or there were messages that I wasn't picking up on, but now that I'm putting 2 and 2 together, I can kind of see something. And so, you know, I've never had anyone who said this information is so devastating, you know, that I'm going to, you know, kill myself. You know, that there's never been a hint of that. There has been sorrow, shock, anger, but generally once they get past those emotions, then what they want to dive into is, well, then who in the heck is my dad? And then it becomes a real quest for them to understand enough about genetic genealogy to learn how to, you know, use the tools so that they can figure out, so to speak, who done it. And we guide them through that process.
Question. I began thinking about the Mormon Church. They have historically had the largest database of genealogy. As I understand, millions and millions of names. It's tied to a particular doctrine of theirs. And I wondered if they have taken the step from classical genealogy to DNA testing.
That's a very good question. We work a lot with a group called Family Search, which is the DNA, which is the genealogical arm of the Church of Mormon, and they're very, very interested in this. I mean, it is part of the religion. You know, it's inseparable, I would say, you know, from the religion. And so my first customers, by and large, my first accepting customers, by and large, were either people who were way out there on the fringe, or they were members of the church, because for them it was more than a passing fancy to figure out who their ancestors were and to make sure that the documentation was, you know, was right. And so I recently went to a conference that they put on every year, and I was one of their speakers, and I talked about basically the history of genetic genealogy and how it moved out of, in effect, my bedroom into a very small, you know, 600 square foot office, and then, you know, into a larger place and a larger place, and the additional tools that we added. But I would say probably per capita, our highest, you know, highest percentage of customers probably are in Utah. That's not to say that we don't do great on the East Coast or the South.
I have a question here. How long does it take for you to provide results to the customer? And then once you provide the results, do you give like a printout and then spend some time in explaining? Okay. And it seems like the explaining might be taking more time than actually doing the result, because you have robots working out there. Am I right?
DNA tests take, depending upon what test it is and whether you're ordering before a sale or after a sale, generally results take 3 to 8 weeks. The microarray typically takes about 3 for us to do the full mitochondria, or to do a very large Y-DNA test that can take 7 to 8 weeks. We've written a 30-page ebook that's linked to everyone's personal page behind a user ID and password. You can download the ebook, and there's 10 pages that explain the Y chromosome, the mitochondria, and the autosomal DNA. Plus, we also have you know, free phone and email support. In effect, what we're in is the business of teaching science to non-science majors, or teaching genetics to people who were long past, you know, school when the genetics revolution started. And what we have found is that if I try to teach a person something like on the sciences, you lose most of the people. If, on the other hand, I can make this discovery search about you rather than someone in the abstract, I get people who aren't very interested sitting in the front row and just on the tip of their chair, because they know that they're learning about a way to investigate not history, but their history. So the personalization of the use of the DNA is, I think, what makes all the difference in how successful we can be in educating our customers. The redhead over there.
So there's been a lot of talk, you know, not on genealogy DNA, but like on testing of DNA for breast cancer or fill-in disease. And so I know you're not involved in that, but I would imagine that the future of DNA testing, you might have given some thought to as to how that is going to go in the world, and how do you feel about that and the ethics of it, et cetera?
How do I feel about it?
Feel about it, but do you think that it's,
Well,
because it's, somebody has a breast cancer gene, so they go and they get a double mastectomy and a hysterectomy today. And so if you find out your 4-year-old has a predisposition to some...
Well, first of all, I would say that I don't think that children should be tested for late onset diseases.
Okay.
I think that it can be, psychologically scarring, although I don't have the credentials to say that with the moral authority of a higher being. I think that as time goes on, that we're going to use DNA more and more and more, because in effect it can be used properly a first line of defense, in the same way that some populations are told to start taking prostate exams at 40, while the general population may be advised at 50. Medical science is doing that for a reason, because they've noticed that a population is more at risk. If I could, for example, provide you a test that told you that you had a mutation that was linked to colorectal cancer, I think that most people would be not excited about, but willing to go, to someone to have that, checked out on a regular basis. And I think that as time goes on, I think that concept is going to become more and more recognized. And I don't envision a day necessarily in my lifetime, but I would imagine that a day is coming when it will be to the advantage of the medical system to know what we are predisposed to, so that we can invest our finite, precious medical dollars in the most targeted fashion, so that we don't end up testing everyone for something that 97% of the population, it's a wasted test. It would make more sense to know what you are susceptible to and to really hone in on that. And I think that can be extended to prostate cancer or colorectal cancer or breast cancer or any of those sorts of things. Okay.
I have a question, and I'm not quite sure even how to phrase it, so here we go. I remember when you were talking about your name, and you said maybe your name wasn't even that name. And so it caused me to wonder whether or not you match DNA profiles just with all other profiles.
So,
like in a big database.
In answer to your question, which I believe is, if I do a DNA test, kind of like, what do you tell me, or what do we bounce the results off of? We have a database which has over 700,000 individuals who have tested. So when you test, you are compared not based on your name, but based on your DNA signature to the entire database. And anyone that you match comes back just as that, as a match. So if in the example of Mr. Grimes, who thought he was a Grimes, and who was a member of the Grimes DNA project, when he found out that he was only matching Johnsons, I noticed when I was putting this together last night that he is also a member of the Johnson surname project, not just the Grimes, surname project. And the way he knows that is we made a comparison between his signature and the entire database, and then we see what comes out of it. There's another example of the same thing. There's a fellow named Richard Hill who was adopted. He did a DNA test, and it showed one particular name that he matched. And that's all he matched. So he had a very strong indication that's likely the name of his father. And so with that piece of information, he could then go and kind of narrow his search in such a way that he didn't waste a lot of time, kind of like a laser beam. He was very, very focused on finding men just with that surname, because since he matched 5 or 6 men with that surname, none of whom were in the town that he was born in and didn't know that they had relatives in the town that he was born in, but he went back to the city directory for 1940 and 1950, and he found people with that name in his city, which was Detroit, and he ultimately tracked down some of their children and volunteered to pay for their DNA test, and they came out as a match. So that's essentially how it works. Okay. Yes, sir.
I think you had mentioned that you were working on maybe some other projects. If you're free to share with us what any of those are you working on any new applications or any new breakthroughs that you're envisioning? Well,
first of all, we're always working on new stuff. There's a lot of enhancements to that autosomal DNA test. We're working on an interesting computational biology project right now that will allow us to, in effect, phase data, which means that instead of using the concept of 1/2 identical by descent, we'll be able to ferret out what you had on both sides. So whether you had an A from your dad, the question is, do you have an A from your mom or a T from your mom, for example? So we're working on that project. We've recently launched a DNA testing discovery project where we sequence about 11 million base pairs of the Y chromosome. We're doing that to help people find their personal mutations. In other words, mutations on the Y chromosome that have formed in the last century or 2 centuries or 3 centuries, because in effect what our customers want to do is they want to put themselves not on a branch of the tree, but they want to go from the branch to a limb, to a twig, all the way out to the end of the tree. And so we brought that out not too long ago. And then we're also involved, because one of our partners is an MD. We're also involved in prenatal testing and copy number variation testing, and we see that as a real growth area for us. As I was mentioning earlier, we have finite medical dollars to spend, and if you know that you are at risk or you know that you're a carrier for something, by being aware of it, you can make decisions in your life. I mean, maybe the one perfect woman isn't the one perfect woman if the odds are 1 in 4 that you're going to have a child who's going to not survive. And so, that's a kind of a new portion of the company. Within the last 18 months, we've gotten CAP and CLIA certified. So we're just one more CAP and CLIA certified laboratory in the United States, but it gives us, certain abilities to sell medical tests that are real hardcore medical tests. Okay. Yes, ma'am. About one of them, and louder.
Let me get a mic to you
okay.
Up there.
Get on video.
You're hiding way back here. Are you going to ask something you're ashamed of? Let's hear it.
Just 2 questions or just one? One questions?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is, what regions or what countries that you don't have enough database, you don't have enough data to make a reliable conclusions? And
Okay. So the answer to that one is real easy. It's Native American. And the reason that Native American is a problem is that the Native Americans as a people feel that, they've had everything taken from them. They're not interested in playing this game. I think some of it has to do with the fact that Native Americans, if someone married into the tribe, that person was considered part of the tribe. And I think that some Native Americans are concerned that they're going to find out that when they do a DNA test that their father's father's father really wasn't Native American, and that's going to hurt their self-image. It may have people in the tribe question whether they should be allowed to be in the tribe. And so I would say that the Native American community in the United States in particular, and to a lesser extent, North America in general, are very hesitant to do any DNA testing. So that's really an empty hole. The second area that's kind of an empty hole for us is Central Asia. Not a lot of people go to Central Asia, and there's not a lot of people in the United States, who are from Kazakhstan or other Central Asian countries. And so that's a region that's also, kind of missing. Barring that, I think that we have, I think we're pretty well populated around the planet. Okay. And you had a second question?
Yes, the second question is, do you get data from other associations, or are they all come from people that went to your business directly?
I would say that just a small portion of our database comes from cooperation with other folks. Sometimes we will, go to a professor we know who's written a paper that's particularly interesting, and we would like to have a particular population, that he has. So if someone writes a study and they've tested 100 males from Tajikistan, we're likely to try to reach out to that fellow and see if, he'd be willing to share his data. Sometimes you don't even have to ask if they're willing to share the data, because when you publish, generally you have to put your evidence, your DNA evidence, also into the public domain. And so at that point, ourselves and any of our competitors are free to grab that. Okay, most of what we have actually does come from our customers. There's another one?
I have a CSI kind of question. So far we're talking about buccal swabs, but it seems like in some of the CSI type things, people were acquiring either, I guess, maternal mitochondrial samples through hair, or they were getting non-buccal swab material like in saliva or cigarette butts, etc. Can you describe the physical limitations of that, and then the legal limitations of taking someone's DNA from the hairdresser or from the dentist or something of that nature?
Okay, nice question. Thank you. I'm not able to answer on the legal or the forensic side of it. I can tell you, as a laboratory, we don't take hair, because typically people do with hair exactly what you did when you were talking and mentioning the hair. You touch it. So if great-grandma's hair is on a brush, or if a few locks of her hair was cut when she was 9 and it's been saved for 140 years, the first thing we do without thinking is take our fingers, which have our DNA, and pull it across the shank or the hair. On the other hand, if the hair has the bulb of the hair, then the likelihood that we can get DNA from it is very good. We've gotten out of the tooth crushing business. We no longer take stamps, the lickable stamps. We have done chewing gum, although we're not wild about it. We ask customers not to send us personal undergarments. Although sometimes one spouse or the other spouse is kind of insistent. Okay. What other items? Cigarette butts. Cigarette butts would work. We don't take bone. And all of these items are highly likely to be contaminated if they are picked up by someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And the other point I would make in relation to CSI is that there's no DNA test that takes 3 hours, let alone 30 minutes. Although, having said that, you can get the results quite quickly if that's all the laboratory is doing. we're set up as as a grind it through shop, so to speak, where we'll extract 500 DNA samples a day that all come into us with the same identical buccal swab protocol. But if we had to do, the bulb of hair one day and a cigarette butt later that afternoon and a couple pieces of chewing gum, it would take the same tech's time as it takes to extract, 500 samples. And so for us, as a commercial company, without the benefit of taxpayers' dollars at the crime lab, it doesn't make sense, for us to do that. Also, I think that as we move into the end of this decade and into the next decade, I think that DNA extraction techniques will become much more robust, and that the likelihood of getting something that is typically not obtainable today will be obtainable in the future. So if you have that precious keepsake from a relative, rather than sending it off to some DNA lab which says we might be able to get it, I would recommend that you wait 5 or 10 years, and I think you'll have a better shot at it. Okay, let's see. All right, go here, and then we'll go over here.
How much is the cost of DNA?
I'll repeat. Okay.
How much has the cost of the technology to test DNA gone down over the past 15 years? And have you been passing that on to the consumers in commensurate fashion?
So today, DNA tests cost between $1 and, let's say, $300. And we have 3 different tests. So one of them, an entry-level test is $99. One, the basic test, I think, is $69. You can spend up to $200 on that one. And the other one, the basic test, is about $100, and you can spend a couple $100 more if you decide you want to look at a greater expanse of the DNA. The test that had 12 markers that I sold for $219 when I started, we took off the market at $59 because we just thought that the dimes didn't add up to anything, and we thought we would use a test that had more markers, that was more specific, that we could tell you more about, and so that it also gave us a chance to to make a profit on it. Pricing has come down substantially. There's one test that we launched at $795 that we now sell on sale for $150. So just to give you an idea, technology is having a big impact on that. We've moved from what's called first-generation sequencing technology, which was what was used to sequence the human genome on those applied bioscience machines where there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Now we have a different type of equipment, typically made by a sequencing manufacturer called Illumina that I mentioned earlier. The equipment cost is 1/3 of what the equipment cost prior, and it'll typically process 3 times as much work in the same amount of time. And so those savings, which have been fairly substantial to us, of course are passed on, because we know that every time we lower the price, the market expands more than what we lose in margin dollars, especially when you're dealing on a direct-to-consumer product. It might not be that way if I was selling, medical tests for cancer, because a good salesman could convince you that it's cancer and it's your life and it's really serious, and don't worry about, the amount of money, worry about life. But on a direct-to-consumer item, there's only so much you'll pay. I mean, you might, pay something for a DNA test on yourself. You might pay something, for a DNA test on your dog, but you're not going to pay $1,000 likely for either. Okay, and over here.
Do you have a question?
My question is about the criteria that you use to prove 2 persons are relative in a society like U.S. with a huge variety in the genetic pool, in comparison to the other societies that they have a smaller genetic pool. So like small herbs that they have a lot of internal marriage, so the genetic pool is more conserved. I mean, how is the criteria in huge genetic pool in comparison to the smaller?
First of all, it depends on which test we're talking about. Let's say we're talking about the autosomal DNA test, which is where a restricted or expanded genetic pool would I think, be the most, practical thing to talk about. In cases like that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prove typically if we have found an aunt, uncle, niece, nephew, or a first cousin. Sometimes you can go back and look at, second, third cousins, sometimes even fourth cousins. And the amount of DNA, of shared DNA of people who who have identity by state rather than identity by descent is typically going to be characterized by two things. Number one, a lot less DNA in common than a real relative. And number two, the block size is going to be significantly smaller if it's identity by state. In other words, if I take 100 people and 100 men, 100 women, put them on an island, come back in 1,000 years, and they had no invaders, yes, they're all going to have, they're all going to look similar, but they're not going to have enough DNA in common to be, to be first cousins. If your effective population size is really small, I mean, incredibly small, is in a few dozens of, of families a long time back, they will end up sharing a huge amount of DNA. So we find that Amish and Eastern European Jews have, on balance, about 1% more DNA in common than the average person that we test. So that's kind of interesting, but it's not off the charts. Recently, I looked at the DNA of a Polynesian. Now, this Polynesian guy didn't know anyone on his match list, but he had so much DNA in common that actually looked like he was somewhere between a first and second cousin with every single person on his list, which was 20 people. And it was so extraordinary that I sent this information on to Dr. Hammer saying, you got to look at this. This is like, we've never seen this. We've tested hundreds of thousands of people, and we've never seen this much overlapping DNA in anyone except in this Polynesian population. And so that tells us that they must have had an incredibly small effective population size who married within and married within and married within, and over time, they built up huge amounts of DNA in common, but that is exceptionally rare. However, if we were to test people from isolated valleys where, the only people for centuries that you've married is from that valley, you will have an overexpressed amount of DNA from those folks. And that could make other kinds of DNA testing for forensic purposes, shall we say, a little bit more challenging. Fortunately, that's not the business I'm in. So again, I'm on the soft side. All I'm trying to do is prove, that these people are related to each other, and occasionally who's the father, not in a paternity sense, but kind of in a genealogical sense.
The other question is that, and basically the criteria for
I can't hear you.
Okay. The criteria to prove two persons are relatives, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Two persons are relatives is the homology between the entire or the total DNA sequence, or just in the polymorphism sequences.
Okay. Without giving away something that we haven't patented yet, I will tell you that what we do is we build blocks. So just imagine that we'll look at a location here on chromosome number 1, position number 1, and then we'll look at chromosome number 1, position 1,000, and chromosome number 1, position 2,000. And what we're doing is we're looking for long stretches of DNA where the results are at least half identical by descent. So if we have a no call, okay, that becomes a no information there. And if we have a base pair that is not a match, then that is where the block ends. So we build up these blocks. Generally, what we'll do when we're showing parent-child, aunt, uncle, niece, nephew, first cousin, second cousin, and third cousin, we will use total amount of DNA in common. And the only place I would be now concerned about using that is Polynesia. On the other hand, when we find small blocks, it's very indicative of being identity by state rather than identity by descent, which I think makes sense to a scientist, doesn't make sense to most of our customers, because they're just looking for relatives. And so however they get to 100 centimorgans, they don't really care. And we have to caution them and explain to them that, yes, you might have 100 cm in common with this person, and that they might have 100 cm with someone else, but there's a difference between 50 2 centimorgan blocks and 2 50 centimorgan blocks. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, very good. I think I can take one more.
Right here in the middle there. We have a very patient woman.
Sorry. My daughter has an adopted boy from Uzbekistan. So I think we're going to do his DNA. We're going to have actually a DNA party up in Huntsville and do a lot of people, but he's going to come up and have his. So I think that's some information you would like to have, right?
Yes, that would be interesting, and we love those DNA parties. I mean, frankly, I can't think of hardly any other better party to go to. I want to thank you all for your attention.
For a great program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep, that's still live. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoyed the program as much as I did. If you didn't get to ask your question, and I notice there are a couple of hands over there, please see Bennett after the program, we finish the program here, and ask your questions. But thank you all for coming. Please drive home safely. And I'll make one last comment about volunteers for our organization. If what you've seen here tonight you enjoy and you'd like to get involved with our organization, put on other great programs like this, please come and see myself, Darcy, Stephen, Nick, anybody on the executive committee, and we'd love to have you get involved. Sponsorship, if you do not see your name, your company's name up there on our sponsor list, and you think that your company would benefit from being associated with our organization and supporting these types of programs, please also come and see us. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we'll see you at the next event.